Are you having a hard time figuring out what to get Dad for Father's Day? Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1 and save 15% off your order when you check out Row 1 Brand's Vintage Sports Pictorium Gallery. They have America's best sports art. With over 7,200 historic sports prints, you're assured to find something unique for Dad this Father's Day. If he's an NFL buff, check out the 1963 vintage NFL helmet poster. Shop now at sportshistorynetwork.com/row1.
This is our league, and this is your league. From the 55-yard line on CFL America Radio and the Sports History Network.
This is a league of A's and BCs. It's green and red and gold and black and blue. This is a league with 2 official languages and many unofficial languages. It's East versus West, wheat versus iron, love versus hate. This is a league where superstars are extraordinary and ordinary at the same time. It's a league of ice, of fog, of mud and wind. And for one Sunday in November, it's the nation's glue. This is a league as diverse as a country, a league of Jacksons and Kwongs, Johnsons, Moscas, O'Shea's, and Haji Razulis. This is his league, her league, their league, and their league. It's my league, and it's your league. This is our league.
Hey, and welcome to the 55-yard line with Greg here and Scott. And we just wrapped up a great interview with Paul Woods and talked with him at length about his book, The Year of the Rocket, and other things going on in the CFL world, including XFL rumors and such. So, but before we get to that, Scott and I are just going to talk real quickly here about the playoffs this past weekend and kind of give our Grey Cup predictions. So what say you? Yeah, that's right. If I remember correctly from the Twitter feed, you didn't get a chance to see much.
I didn't see either one because I don't get ESPN News. Even though I have the ESPN Plus app, you've got to have the subscription if it's on one of their, channels or whatever. So
yeah,
I didn't get to see and I'm a Ticats fan, so that kind of sucked to not see them. And then the second game, I was at a G League game, so I couldn't have seen it anyway. But
yeah.
Glad that the Ticats are in it.
It was, you know what? I mean, the game started, the way the Argonauts were playing and actually the way the Ticats were not playing, by halftime, I'm like, hey, the Argos are going to win this thing. And the Ticats came roaring back, literally and figuratively. And, so it was a great game. And apparently even I wouldn't say it was a better ending because it didn't end well for at least one Ticats fan and one Argos player after the game, because video went around I don't know what was, I saw that. I'm like, oh, wow. And it pretty much went viral. And I've seen a lot of stuff on Twitter talking about it. And, you never want to see that at a game.
No, you just know it's a bad look regardless. Yeah. So,
I mean, even here,
especially this.
Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, even here in Chicago, where we've got some great rivalries in that between the Packers and the Bears, you never see anything like that.
Well, this whole season with the CFL, I mean, they don't need any more bad news. I mean, it's been kind of, just with the level of play and it's like the commissioner just kind of disappeared. I assume they still have one, but
yeah, you know what? It's a good point. And we were talking to Paul. I didn't bring that up, but yeah, where has Randy been? Because to me, it just seems like the league is kind of rudderless right now. I mean, in other leagues, you always see the commissioner pretty much out front but I don't recall seeing anything from the league. I mean, from the commissioner about what happened. So I'll be curious to maybe I missed something on Twitter. I mean, that could very well be the case, but yeah, it just seems like Randy's kind of hasn't been around much.
No, it's just, again, this whole season's just been, I mean, I'm glad they played it, obviously, especially after losing the season last year, but it's, just the level of play. And again, I haven't been able to watch all the games, so it's not like I've been this huge student of every game being played, but I've had the misfortune. Usually the games I have watched have been mostly boring. And that's not what I want to see when I'm watching the Canadian Football League,
Yeah. No, I'm right there with you. And we had the Winnipeg Saskatchewan game, which was a great game, but anybody who watched that, the Rough Riders really gave them a good game. I mean, there were some turnovers, and I'm thinking, I think they're gonna give them a run, and they did, but ultimately, the Big Blue Machine just wore them down. But it was cool to watch. Both those games had snow going on. There was that element, so I'm looking forward to this coming weekend when thank God the game will be on. Is it going to be on ESPN or ESPN2? Usually it's
ESPN2, yeah. And that's
right.
that's a big day for me. I mean, the Grey Cup is regardless of who's in it, it's always a big event for me. But the fact that I'm a Ticats fan and they're in it makes it better.
It's going to be an interesting Sunday night for me because I will have the Bears Packers because they're playing a night game. They're playing the Sunday night game, and then you've got the Grey Cup going on right about the same time. And so it's going to be another full day of football, and I'm looking forward to it. And it's a rematch. I think the Ticats have a chance, but I'm pretty much going to pick the Blue Bombers. I can't see how they can lose.
Yeah, I'm rooting for the Ticats, so I'm gonna pick the Blue Bombers too, because every time I've picked against Hamilton this year, they've won it. So I'm Blue Bombers all the way for the Grey Cup.
Yeah. And then after this game is over, then, we'll see. Hopefully we'll know more about we'll get a better feel of where we're going, the league is going into the next season. But, after our talk with Paul, there's a lot more questions and answers at this point in terms of.
Yeah. And I always love to hear from him because he knows a whole lot more about it than we do. So when he talks about, when he has a certain idea of how he thinks it's going, I'm gonna trust his gut a lot more than a lot of people. So it's very interesting. I think people are going to really, really be interested in what he had to say.
Yeah, and I love how when we talk with him just about kind of media coverage and everything, and he tells you, hey, who to listen to, who not to listen to. And I did appreciate that because, I've kind of been, I kind of get, and I'll say it, I get on my high horse a little bit about recording and facts and accurate. And it's one thing to report the fact that there are rumors out there. It's another to report rumors as fact. And sometimes there's a blurring of the lines. And I think that happens a lot here down in the States. But to me, I've always, when anything's been going on in the CFL, I always trust people who know the league, have reported on the league for years. For instance, like our buddy Rob Vanstone. He, has written about the writers for years up there in Regina. And, Paul we talk to several other people too. So, but it's going to be, I think we're entering a new era in terms of, kind of with the cross culture. And there were a lot of new CFL fans this year that came because of the XFL talks, which is great. And I was happy to see that, and got some great podcasters out there like Reed and Paul with the Markcast, and then our buddies at the Red, White, and Blue podcast, Red Rouge, White, and Blue podcast. I'm sorry, Oz. I'm sorry, Joe. It's so you've got just a lot of new American fans that are starting to learn the game. So hopefully that bodes well for the future. And the XFL starting back up, and who knows what's going to happen with the USFL, where it's going to be.
Yeah.
And last you heard, you think Birmingham might be out of it right now?
Well, again, this is just speculation on my part because the soccer team, the USL soccer team in Birmingham, signed a lease on Tuesday with Protective Stadium. So I'm just assuming because the USL Stadium in a non-pandemic year starts in March. So they would be playing the same time the new USFL plans to play. Obviously, they're going to look for home dates. And since they're the primary tenant, I don't know how the USFL could use it as a hub to work around the soccer team schedule. Now, they could play at Legion Field.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you. Could they just do the whole USFL season at Legion Field?
Yeah. I mean, they could do that. But, my question is, city leaders were all hyped up about it and saying that an announcement was imminent. And that was more than a month ago, and just nothing. I mean, there's been absolutely nothing. And that's a red flag to me. Yeah. I mean, you'd think they would at least say, look, we're still negotiating. This is what we're doing. And it's just, I don't know. It just makes me wonder if, maybe Fox decided to do something else. I mean, since this first season's basically just going to be a job fair TV deal anyway, you could, hold it in some small stadium and just stage the games there.
Yeah. And too, I mean, when you and I both know, when you have stuff come up like uncertainties, it does in a way kind of, it solidifies the fact that the USFL is going to be minor league football. Period.
Yeah, and my thing, I mean, whether it's the USFL, XFL, Major League Football, whatever, blah, I want them all. I've said it a billion times. I want them to succeed. I wish them the best. Yeah. But, with Birmingham trying to put all this money out there, I don't want to see Birmingham left holding the bag. So if there's any question about what's going to happen, I would rather Birmingham not be the hub and not be left with all this money spent on something that may or may not last,
Right.
So, but that's just me. That's just one guy's opinion.
Oh yeah, no, but I agree 100% with you. It's yeah. So, all right. Well, it's going to be interesting to see where we go into the new year in 2022 with not only the USFL, with what's going to happen with the CFL, but obviously, the XFL is starting to ramp up, which is good to see. It's nice to see that there's a timetable and things are starting to take place. And
it's kind of funny to me that their training camp, I believe, or their combine is going to be in June of next year, which is right in the middle of the USFL season. So that's kind of funny.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, the thing is, I mean, there's a lot of football guys out there who want to play football. So, maybe I think, possibly, and we talked, I've mentioned before, paradigm shift coming. Maybe this is all part of it. And, maybe in 2023, even though they called off talks, maybe we'll have a combined league or something with CFL, and who knows, maybe the XFL will buy the USFL. I mean, so many things could happen between now and then. And we could still be wearing masks and getting booster shots for, another unnamed variant out there too. So there's a lot of things coming down. But the one thing that is coming down for everybody, we're going to be talking with Paul Woods here at the end of this. But actually, before you listen to Paul Woods, I'm going to toss something in there that I know everybody will enjoy about John Candy and the Argos. And then after that, it's our talk with Paul Woods. And buddy, until next year, have a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. And obviously, you and I will be talking quite a bit on Twitter in the meantime.
Sounds good. Happy holidays, folks.
All right. Hey, everyone, have a good one. And to all our friends out there, we'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.
At the Sports History Network, we're all about sports yesteryear, and so we're so pleased to introduce you to Row One, an online memorabilia gallery and shop that brings you sports history to life anywhere. The Row One gallery includes over 5,200 gorgeously reproduced prints of team posters, game program covers, game tickets, advertisements, and more in baseball, pro and college football, pro and college basketball, and more. And any gallery item may be printed in a variety of sizes on wood, metal, canvas, acrylic, or poster paper. And in Row One shop, check out the thousands more of unique items with the retro and historical designs dating back to 1876, including t-shirts, long sleeve shirts, phone cases, mugs, blankets, pillows, towels, and even shower curtains. Go to sportshistorynetwork.com, ROW1, for access to the full Row One catalog and for gallery prints and gift items, plus get a 15% discount off all prints on the Row One Pictorium Gallery with coupon code SHN15. Follow the link on the show notes.
I was out playing on all the special teams, and I guess my legs had just kind of gotten tired and realized I was running down on the kickoff. We had just scored, and all of a sudden my legs, I just feel like it popped. Trainers come out, and I'm down. I'm like, man, I'm trying to think, did I blow out my knee? What's going on? And I look up, and John's, he's coming across the field like this. He's just, like with intent. Like he's coming, I'm going, oh, because, you're embarrassed. Like not the owner's coming out to get you.
I go back to check. John's on one knee doing the Our Father. He's praying with Carl, who was a religious man at the time, about their injury. And I just looked at the moment. No owner is doing this. This was passion.
I think family always comes first, and then, Argonauts probably, and then his acting. I don't remember him doing too many movies or anything during that time period. But definitely, I think they came second, if not first.
He really did live and die double blue. I might have been one of the last persons to talk to John before he passed away. He called to tell me that the team was going to be sold and they would no longer be involved. They decided to pull out his partners.
Did you get the sense that he was sad?
Oh, absolutely. He went along with the decision, but yeah, he was sad. I get on the plane that morning, I fly up to Vancouver, and it comes over on the radio that John Candy just passed away that morning down in Mexico doing his film. And I had to stop the car and pull over to the side of the road. I just couldn't believe it.
Who wants an orange whip? Orange whip? Orange whip? 3 orange whips.
John Candy was a bona fide movie star, comic movie star.
Where do you live?
In the city.
Do you have a house?
Apartment.
Own or rent?
Rent.
What do you do for a living?
Lots of things.
Where's your office?
I don't have one.
He is an icon.
John, is work still fun for you?
The work is, and I tell you, the business part of it wears thin for me now.
Mm-hmm.
That really does. The negotiations on all the people, and everybody's your friend, and it's your new best friend. I'm going through that point in my life, I think, right now. I'm sort of cutting back and reflecting and looking back. What do I want to do now?
I was on the board of directors of Hollywood Park Racetrack. On the board was Harry Ernest. And we were talking one day, and he just said, you like Canadian sports. He said, I just bought into the Toronto Argonauts in the CFL. I said, oh, that's interesting.
John loved it more than anybody. And I think one of the reasons that Bruce McNall actually pursued the Toronto Argonauts is because John Candy so much wanted to be a part of it.
In February 1991, Bruce McNall, Wayne Gretzky, and John Candy purchased the Toronto Argonauts.
We bought the team for $5 million, and John and Wayne each took 10%. I realized one thing at the time, though, with John, and that is that, this could get expensive. So I said, maybe we should cap John. So we did. We capped him at $1 million, I think it was, so that he couldn't lose more than that, no matter what happens.
Going into ownership with Bruce McNall and Wayne Gretzky was a perfect fit for John Candy. McNall was a successful and high-profile sports owner who, in dramatic star-studded fashion, had turned the Los Angeles Kings around and made hockey a hot attraction in Southern California. McNall saw similar turnaround potential in both the Argonauts and the CFL. But for John Candy, purchasing the Toronto Argonauts was about much more than business. It was personal.
When we first started Second City, we used to call John Johnny Toronto. This kind of dude, right? Because he just kind of had his finger on everything. And that character kind of morphed into Johnny LaRue.
12 noon, I'm Johnny LaRue.
John buying the Argo was that we told him, John, you're actually now turning into Johnny LaRue. You now own a football team.
It was just kind of like this Argonaut tidal wave kind of hit our family. You just see there was excitement all around about it.
It got to the point where on my mom's birthday we had a Rose Bowl, so we would actually create our own football teams. We'd get we'd get jerseys made, and we had teams and we'd play together.
How great is it he becomes an owner of his hometown team? Just think about it. How great is that? So he just loved it.
John Candy was born in Newmarket, Ontario, but grew up in East York, a Toronto suburb. His father passing away when John was 5, Candy didn't gravitate to football until high school.
Played left tackle on the offensive line. He was a funny guy, but when it came to football, he was very serious about being good at what he did.
Oh, my goodness. Wow. From 1967, junior champs at Neil McNeil. That was his forte. That was his outlet.
Toronto on the Hamilton 26-yard line.
Cookie Gilchrist, Dick Shadow, they were our football heroes for sure. John definitely had seasons tickets. That was a quasi-religion for him, going to Argo games.
He wanted a career in football. When he was in high school, he's like, okay, I'm going to be a football player.
He had a pretty serious knee injury that prevented him from playing further, and I think that he was saddened by that because I know he loved football very much.
I had started a talent agency, and we had opened an office right across from Eaton's College Street. And they had a cafeteria in the basement. And a couple of times I had bumped into this young man, and we just got along great. I asked him what he wanted to do. Did he want to be an actor? And he sort of said no, he wanted to be a football player. But he had been injured, and it just so happened that that day we got delivered to us a commercial, and they were looking for young men to play in a football team. To his surprise, he got it. And I told him, here, you're playing a football player now. You can say you were a football player. And he said, yes, but one day I'm going to own the Argos. And I thought it was a joke. And he was serious. He said, no, I'm going to own the Argos.
It's become the National Football League's rite of spring. And hello once again, everybody. I'm Chris Berman. Last night, Rocket Ismail decided to lift off and land as a member of the Toronto Argonauts of the Canadian Football League.
In 1991, Rahib the Rocket Ismail out of the University of Notre Dame was the projected #1 overall pick at the NFL Draft. Foregoing the NFL, Ismail signed a record 4-year, $18 million contract with Bruce McNall and the Toronto Argonauts.
I think it was more of a shock than anything else. He's not going to the Dallas Cowboys. He's going to go play in the CFL.
Candy was thrilled. Overnight, there was a buzz in Toronto.
How many tickets are you looking for?
Phones have been ringing off the hook.
Everyone was talking about the Argonauts.
Would you welcome John Candy and Maureen O'Hara? Has John tried to sell you an interest in any football teams at all?
Not. Thank you. The Argonauts, yes.
You going to be involved in picking players and all that stuff?
I'll be blocking for them. With that kind of money, I'm looking after them.
That was just John improvising, He is such a fan. He was so great that way.
Living his dream as an Argo owner, the 40-year-old movie star put his career on hold and became a tireless promoter of his beloved Argonauts.
The vision was every game was going to be an event. We wanted to make every game a special event, and we kicked it off with the Blues Brothers at halftime and post-game.
First of all, I would wax his car and do his lawn if he asked me, okay? That's how loyal and how much I love this man. He said, hey, Jimmy, you want to come up with a jet with me and Wayne and Bruce and a bunch of people for the opening of the Argonauts game? I went, when's the date?
It was so exciting to have everyone talking about the CFL again. You know, mainly I was there because John was my friend. That's why.
Yes, he lived in LA, but he really loved being Canadian. I think that was his passion for, you know, being a part of this team. He wanted to bring his friends up there and show them a good time and also show him what he was, you know, proud of.
It was showtime every week. It's the Sky Dome, when the roof opened, baby, it was showtime.
I remember the league needing a shot in the arm, and they absolutely provided that. It was the place to be.
We came to see the show. All these seats used to be empty last year.
You have a major movie star who would go to every little nook and cranny to sell not only the Toronto Argonauts, but the whole CFL.
All of Vancouver should be there?
Yeah. We toured the country. We went to every CFL city.
And, you know, he was flying around on his own nickel. At the time, the CFL had a rule that you couldn't lift the blackout unless it was a sellout. John would then do 24 hours of media, and pleading to the fans, come buy a ticket, we're lifting this blackout.
Thank you all for showing up. It's terrific. You know, there are tickets still available.
We would get up at 4 o'clock in the morning, and we'd get in the car and we'd drive to every morning radio show.
John Candy, who's been signing autographs for the last hour or so.
We'd rally the community, we'd go to charity events.
I believe we busted every blackout that season.
He truly enjoyed going to the games, and he loved being a part owner of the Toronto Argonauts. There's no question about it.
Promoting the league was the dream role for John. But the real payoff, the heart of the matter, was his love for the players.
He wanted to hang out with the players, not just in the locker room. He'd invite the guys out, you know, he'd call you if you were injured. I think he would have been with us every second if he could have been.
You know, I remember in Calgary when I had a concussion, and I remember John came into the hospital, and everybody was like, oh, John Candy's here, John Candy. So it made me feel even more important because I'm like, yo, John Candy coming to see me.
His heart was so big. Like, they don't have a cappuccino machine in the locker room. You know, next thing you know, one shows up, you know.
He pulled out an old pack of matches and he wrote his name and he put Candy on it and he gave me his phone number and he said, anything you guys need, anytime, I'll always be there for you.
You know, we can't tell him, but here I'm telling him he did a wonderful job. He touched a lot of us.
With John's passion for the game, you didn't want to let him down.
Dunnigan looks to the end zone. Touchdown!
We didn't lose one game at home that year, which included the Eastern Final where there were 50,000 fans in the stands.
Final score, 42-3. The Toronto Argonauts are heading for the Grey Cup.
Going into the Grey Cup game, I remember John was like, make sure you guys put your helmet up there one more time. You show them who's going to dictate the game, and I get goosebumps still talking about it.
The most inspirational moment for me that entire year may have been John Candy standing on the sideline in a leather coat in 20 below at the Grey Cup. He's not up in the press box where all the heat and all. He is down on the field with his guys. And now all of a sudden, I'm not as cold.
The 1991 edition of the Toronto Argonauts. 36-21 victors over the Calgary Stampeders today at Winnipeg Stadium. And it's appropriate.
It's just beaming, you know? It's like this is so happy.
We had speeches. I got up there and I said, this is about one person. John, please get up here. John got up there and got emotional and he started crying.
To own a team and to see that team in one season go
from I wonder how they'll do to winning the Grey Cup was as thrilling for John as anything could have been.
We had the parade downtown, and it was just like, man, everybody was so happy, and man, I just remember jumping on his back and hugging him, man. He wanted to do something special for the city, and he was actually able to accomplish it and to be a part of it. It really made me feel good.
The pride that he must have felt as a local boy, hoisting that cup, the parade here, that must have been huge for him. 91 was unbelievable. He brought back the passion, the glory of the Toronto Argonauts and of the CFL.
He looked back on it, and it seems like it was a flash in the pan. It seems like it was just it was an explosion of energy, of good times, of passion, love, of pain, sacrifice, and it was just gone.
In 1992, the fairy tale came to an end. Despite winning a Grey Cup the previous year, the high-priced Argonauts were losing money. Star quarterback Matt Dunnigan left for Winnipeg, and the Argos missed the playoffs. McNall's commitment to the team began to waver.
I had a big responsibility in my mind to John and Wayne. John was capped in the investment he'd made at $1 million, but Wayne was not. So we both had to pour money in, and I realized, what could we do to change? I mean, we won the Grey Cup, we had Rocket. I didn't know what else we could do to bring revenues in.
But Candy was determined to turn it around.
I was always looking at angles to try and boost, ticket sales or just keep, morale going in the stands and on the field.
The Rocket left for the NFL, and during a 3-win season in 1993, Candy uncovered a heartbreaking truth.
Do I remember the last time I saw John? Yeah, John and I had a difficult conversation, actually. John was not aware that Bruce had asked me to find a buyer for the team. John felt that I betrayed him and the trust of the club. At the time, I was doing what my boss told me to do.
I talked to John about this, but we said, John, we're gonna have to do something. And it had a lot to do with my own financial situation at the time, because I had major debts out there, trying to find a way to cover everything. CFL was one of the assets. It was losing money. As many assets as I had, a lot of it was a house of cards.
I knew when money from our ticketing office was going to LA to pay hockey bills. There's something going on.
John was emotionally invested. He didn't want to sell.
He was passionate about it. It meant everything to him.
He knew what had to happen. He understood the issues. Emotionally, though, he wore his heart on his sleeve. And the Argonauts were a part of his family. And for him just to walk away from a family member, no, it wasn't going to happen with John.
I could definitely tell when they were in financial trouble, he was having a hard time with it.
It's a Simon and Garfunkel reunion concert, December '93. At that point, John was having what he called panic attacks. It happened maybe a couple of times that night, where we would start walking off the stage, and then he would have to stop, and I would just look over and go, "Panic attack?" And he'd go, "Yeah."
Those last few times that I did see him, he was flying in really tight schedule, coming in just for lunch, and it's like he had a lot on his mind.
The team was sold very quickly, and I think he was in Mexico shooting the film when that did happen.
He got a phone call from Toronto, and they'd been told that the team was sold. I know that really hurt him. If there's any memory of it, is he had love for that team and every player on that team.
I wanted to call him. It was actually the night before he passed, and he liked the support. And I decided not to do it. I don't want to bother him in case he's sleeping or he's resting. I feel really bad that I never made that call.
Good evening. It was news that caught everyone off guard. The laughter stopped, and there were more than a few tears. Canadian actor John Candy has died.
I remember I was at work and I thought my brother was kidding because he called me up on the phone. And I said, man, quit messing around. He said, no, I just heard it on the radio. You think about how many people have the opportunity to help people, but don't. And then you think about somebody who goes out of their way and doesn't have to. And so that's why it was so powerful, like even now.
That little star right there. We put this on on our jersey that next year, in remembering John Candy. This will go to my grave with me. That's just how much he meant to me.
The only regret I have is that my fiasco that I created brought the whole thing into a mess where I had no choice but to sell it.
He's received many awards. I think there wouldn't be a higher honor for him. He'd love it. For him to get his name finally put on it was, a very big deal for us as a family, and I know that he's somewhere, smiling because of it.
I think with anything in life, if you love, you don't care if you get paid or not, because you love doing it, because you have that passion for it. If you don't, if it's a job, then rethink it. If it's, I think anything you do, you have to do it from your heart.
Hi, I'm Oz Davis of the True the Goats podcast here at the Sports History Network. I'd like to take a minute to tell you about quite possibly the greatest website of all time, newspapers.com. If you're listening to this podcast, or any of them at the Sports History Network, you're probably into sports history. And you probably also know that for learning about anything prior to, say, 1990 online, the typical search engines like are nearly completely useless. But then there's newspapers.com. Newspapers.com gives you access to over 640 million pages worth of news from North America, Britain, Ireland, and more, dating from 1798 to last week. Do up a search for Super Bowl I, the 36th Berlin Olympics, Wayne Gretzky's first game, whatever. Newspapers.com takes you there with historical flavor that search engines like just don't give you. And now, get a free 1-week subscription to newspapers.com by visiting sportshistorynetwork.com/newspapers. With a paid subscription, you'll also be helping to support the production of this podcast and other Sports History Network shows. That's sportshistorynetwork.com/newspapers. Newspapers.com. Way better for searches than you know what I'm talking about.
Hey, welcome, Paul. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Greg and Scott. Nice to be here.
Guys, just I talked to Greg earlier. I read the book, and of course, Greg and I both collect all kinds of sports books. We have whole libraries. And one thing I'll say about your book, most of the books I've read, I've enjoyed, but a lot of them, I just kind of put them away and don't worry about them again. Your book is a book that I'm going to go back and read over and over again. It's one of the most fun reads I've ever had. It's just so well done. And I'm not just saying that because you're here, but it probably means more since you are here to say it in front of you.
Well, thank you very much, Scott. I much appreciate it. It's thrilling to hear that it resonates with readers, and particularly with somebody like you who has written at least one book as well, which I was very much enjoyed, by the way. So thank you very much.
Yeah, it was fantastic. And there was just, I mean, everything. Obviously, if you're a football fan, a CFL fan, you're going to love it. But there's just so much there with the entertainment angle and everything. I mean, there's entry points for all sorts of different kinds of people.
Yeah, well, you can tell why I wanted to write it, right? Because of the fact that it's such a massive, broad, sweeping story with so many angles that go beyond football, and the football angles are amazing too, right? So there was so much there. It was definitely worth doing, and it was worth every effort I put into it.
Yeah, and I mean, you crossed. I mean, talking about that, I mean, literally, you're crossing the continents, you're crossing sports, and the great part about this, obviously, to me, is as I was reading it, going to the John Candy parts of it too. And how has the reception been? How has the reception been of the book in Canada? Are you getting a lot of, when it came out, how are sales, I guess, in a way? How are sales going? Things going
Yeah,
good?
apparently very well, Greg. I mean, I've been told by the publisher that they're into a second printing, so that's obviously very positive.
Oh, yeah.
That's great.
We apparently got pretty good traction in the States. I heard something to suggest that there've been something like 1,000 or more copies sold south of the border, which is fantastic, because obviously it's published by a Canadian outfit, and the bulk of the publicity was up here. So yeah, it's great. I mean, I've had nothing but positive feedback. A number of outlets have reviewed it, in both Canada and the U.S. I got lots of press coverage
Right.
in print, on radio, in podcasts, and so on. So yeah, so far so good. I mean, we're in that last push before Christmas, and hoping people that are going into stores looking for a sports book for their dad or their uncle or their brother will find it. Right? It's that's what. The big bookstore up here, Chapters Indigo, told the publisher back in the spring when it was still kind of being they were in the process of sort of finalizing the design and everything, that they thought it was a great Christmas book for dad. So I could live with that. If a whole pile of dads get it for Christmas, that's fine with me, right?
Well, I'll keep pushing the John Candy memes out with your book.
Absolutely,
with your book.
Yeah, now the one with John holding the book, it's an absolute classic. I had to save that photo. That's just a beautiful picture, man.
Well, you know how I am with the memes, and I was just sitting there one day, and I'm like, wait a minute, why? Oh, this is too perfect. And so that was kind of the genesis of it. I think I was doing memes and respond to something else, and it dawned on me, why am I not putting Paul's book front and center on that? So that was the whole genesis of that.
Well, you did a great job. Like you got the fingers holding the book and everything. It's fantastic.
And with the reception, so with Toronto back in '91, and do you see any parallels from where things were in '91 to now? And I know, without getting too much of what might happen in the future, but to me, when I read the book, it was almost like I kept referring back to where we're at now, and I do see some parallels in terms of the CFL was not in the greatest shape back in the early '90s, and what lessons were learned during that period of time, do you think, that are applicable to kind of where we're at today?
Well, that's a great question. Certainly, there were some parallels. I mean, you're right, and I get into this to some extent in the book about the fact that the league was in pretty dire straits in a number of its markets at the time, and interest had been declining in Toronto for most of the previous decade. I mean, the interest kind of peaked. In terms of attendance, it peaked in, I believe, 78 in Toronto, but interest was still high into the early 80s. I mean, the 83 Eastern final between the Argos and Tiger Cats, or it's the same that played this past weekend, it had 54,000 people at Exhibition Stadium. So the building was full and the place was rocking, and interest was really high then. The Argos won the Grey Cup the week after, but from that point on, oddly enough, the interest sort of gradually declined from 84 on, and by 1990, they were in this giant new stadium, Sky Dome, and they were not coming close to selling it out. They were, averaging. I mean, the official average. I have to go back and look at the numbers in the book, but I think the official average in 1990 was 32,000. But nobody believed that. It was more like 20 or 22 actual bodies in the seats. By today's standards would be really great, but at that time was seen as a big disaster in a 54,000 seat stadium. I mean, the one thing that I guess is probably different from then to now is that even though interest had been declining in the Argos over that decade, nobody seemed to think the Argos were the biggest problem in the CFL. And right now, I think you can find a lot of people that would say the Argo franchise is the biggest problem in the CFL. Back then there was a bankrupt team in Ottawa, and Hamilton was drawing 11,000 fans with an owner that desperately wanted to get rid of them. BC Lions had been through a succession of owners and were struggling to find one. We just got a few years removed from Calgary Stampeders almost going out of business. The Montreal Alouettes had gone out of business. So there was a whole pile of problems. And the Argos, even though their attendance had dwindled bit by bit over the course of the 1980s, were still one of the bigger draws in the league and were not perceived as sort of on the verge of folding or anything else. Whereas now I'm worried about their long-term future. In terms of the part of the question about, what lessons can be drawn, it's a really interesting question. It certainly was evident in 1991 that big names helped sell Canadian football in Toronto and around the CFL. I mean, bringing in, John Candy and Wayne Gretzky and Bruce McNall and them signing Rocket Ismail sparked a massive amount of interest compared to what had been going on for the previous decade or so. Since last time big names had been brought up to the league, which was 81 with Vince Ferragamo coming up from the Rams and some other big name NFL players, Billy White, Shoes Johnson, and so on. That was really the last time there'd been big names brought into the league. So it was a decade earlier. And when those names, of course, some of them weren't on the field. And Candy and McNall and Gretzky, they were owners. They were in the owner's box or on the sidelines. They weren't playing, but they brought a lot of attention to the league in Toronto and around the CFL. Some people believe that if the Argos were to do that again, if they were to go out and get a really big name player, it might help sell football in Toronto. I don't know if I buy it, frankly. I don't think I do. I mean, it might have a short-term uptick like it did in 91. The Argos attendance did go up significantly in 91, but not to a sold-out Sky Dome. And then it started going back again the next year. And there were a lot of reasons for that. Some of them were that they overpriced tickets and that the market was really, it wasn't as strong as the ownership group thought it was after that first year. They needed to build it for several more years, and they didn't have the money to do that. Some of it was this weird habit that Torontonians have of losing interest in the Argos right after they win the championship. That seems to happen every time. It's like people go, okay, we can move on to something else now. We've done that. So in terms of a lesson, I don't think, we're not in a position right now to test it because the pricing of the two leagues has gone completely askew. The Argos outbid the NFL for Rocket Ismail. They paid him more than any player had ever been paid to play gridiron football on either side of the border. He was making more than Joe Montana and Jerry Rice and every other star in the NFL, and more than anybody had ever been paid. To do that now, the Argos would have to sign, they would have had to have signed Trevor Lawrence to a contract for $60 million, right? Because I think Pat Mahomes makes about 50. So to outbid the NFL now and pay more than anybody in history, you'd have to go that high. And of course, that's not even remotely feasible. The CFL's whole salary cap for a team is $5.5 million. Right. So they're clearly not able to replicate that. There was an attempt at it a couple of years ago. Hamilton brought in Johnny Manziel, and then he ended up in Montreal for a bit. And there was some belief that would spark interest. There were people, certainly there were fans online saying the Argos should go get Manziel and put seats in BMO Field. I didn't buy it. I still don't buy it. I'm not sure there's an NFL star short of Pat Mahomes or Trevor Lawrence or somebody of that ilk who you could say confidently would put people into the building. And so we're not going to see that. I think the lesson that I would say didn't necessarily arise out of 1991, but that I think in the context of 91 makes sense now, is that the Argos are in a struggle here in this market. The market's gotten more complicated. Back then there were only 3 teams: the Blue Jays, the Leafs, and the Argos. Now there's 5. There's way more entertainment options here. The market is just way harder to crack than it was in 91, and it was hard to crack in 91. I mean, those guys brought in Rocket. They did a lot, and they still couldn't sell the building out. And then next year attendance went down. This is a really tough market for Canadian football. It was tough then, and it's tougher now.
And back then, I mean, when in 91 you had one person who was a one-man marketing crew. And tell us about that, and just in terms of his impact back then on selling the Argos. Because, I mean, that was one of my favorite parts of this book, was reading about John Candy and his commitment. Because to me, he came across, I could identify, I think all of us can identify with John Candy and the passion that all of us have for not only our favorite team, but also our favorite league.
Yeah, well, it's true. Candy is basically the star of the story. I mean, he's the hero. He passionately loved the Argonauts, and he worked his ass off in 1991 to promote the league and the team. And he was loved across the country. Everywhere he went, people went berserk. And that's also, one of the things that when you think about now is there even an equivalent of a John Candy in existence? I don't think there is. I mean, there's nobody that's universally loved the way that John is, I don't think, right? And so there's no way you could find an equivalent now of somebody like that could come in and just instantly energize the entire country. I mean, it wasn't just Toronto. It was the whole country was just crazy about the fact that here's Uncle Buck. He's at our stadium, and he's not only at our stadium, but he's here the day before the game at 5 a.m. He's on radio in Regina. Got every station in town saying, buy tickets to tomorrow night's game. We need to see you out here. This is a great product. It's a great league. We're going to have a big game. So yeah, he really was the marketing machine. And, he ended up having to do more of it maybe than he expected, because the guy that they thought would be able to do that, which was Rocket Ismail, was not well suited for that particular task, as they found out pretty early on. And so, I mean, I'm guessing John probably done it anyway. I think that first year, I think he had every intention from the moment he got on board with the ownership group. He had every intention of, I'm going to take this thing as far as I can take it. I am all in. So he would have been regardless. But I think he was as stunned as everybody else, as stunned as McNall and Gretzky were to discover that Rocket was not comfortable talking to reporters and was not comfortable being in the spotlight. And so it was good that John was there to sort of step into the breach. But you're marketing a guy who actually is wearing a suit on the sidelines. He's not the kind of person that a kid's going to put a poster of an owner on a sideline, right? They want a poster of the guy holding the football in his hand and racing down the field. So but you're right. John's such an important part of the story. And my favorite parts of the book are the John Candy sections. And there's a whole chapter about John, but he factors into several chapters because he was so important to the story. And, sadly he ended up dying, right after the whole thing ended, basically. So.
Well, the thing about him too, which I love so much in the book, is you see whether it's an entertainer or a sports figure, you hope they're a certain way, and you don't want to find out anything bad about him. Right. Well, you don't find out anything bad about John Candy. I mean, he really was just the good dude that you saw on screen.
Yeah, it's almost everybody I interviewed. I spoke to more than 100 people for this book, and almost all of them had one-on-one time with John at some point during that year or during those 3 years. And nobody had a bad word to say about the man. I mean, so a few people did say that he party, right? He could drink. He closed the bar. He drank a lot and he smoked a lot. There's no secret of that. But nobody ever saw a bad side of John Candy. I had one player tell me one anecdote about how there was one time he was out in public at some function and some fan was really getting on was really pestering him, and John threw a look at one of his aides get me out of here. And that's the worst thing you heard about John, is that he just wanted to be taken away from an annoying fan. And most of the time he embraced the fans. He bought them drinks. the night before the game in Regina, after he'd been up at 5 a.m. doing radio, and then he probably played golf in the afternoon, and then he goes to the bar in the hotel that night, and he closes the place with a bunch of Saskatchewan fans, right? So he really was what we thought what we would like John Candy to be, having watched all those movies. Scott, that's exactly what he was, right?
Yeah.
And I am glad. I really felt I had a kind of a solemn mission here to make sure that John was portrayed that way, because like I say, if you talk to 100 people and you hear that, it's true. And the only book that's been written about John that I'm aware of is pretty nasty.
Really?
And I wanted to make sure. It's about it's more about his addictions and the way he ran his business and stuff. It doesn't paint a glowing picture of John, and I just think that's wrong. I mean, John's one of the greatest Canadians of all time. He's one of the most lovable humans on the face on the history of Earth, right? And he doesn't deserve to be ripped to shreds. And I wanted to make sure that he was elevated by this story.
And you definitely did. And to me, he came across as the great unifier of the league.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, he
was to me, I mean, like, he was almost de facto commissioner for a year.
Well, yeah, he became the chairman of the expansion committee, and they ended up expanding for 3 years into the U.S. and that was driven by the McNall Group. But John found the new owners of the Ottawa Rough Riders, the Gleibermans out of Detroit, and John was a driving force in some of the other owners that came up here. He was he really was. And there's an interesting story in the book about the Gleibermans, how they were looking at buying the Hamilton Tiger Cats, and when John found out about it, he was furious because the league at that point owned the Rough Riders because they'd gone bankrupt, and so he says, why are you guys not looking at buying Ottawa? And Lonnie Gleiberman says, well, we were directed towards the Tiger Cats by the commissioner, and the commissioner got pushed out of that thing pretty quick. The Argos brokered that sale, and next thing you know, the Gleibermans bought the Ottawa Rough Riders, which needed to happen. Gleibermans are not a well-loved family up here. They did some crazy things over the years with owning the Rough Riders. They later owned the Shreveport Pirates, and Lonnie is kind of a character, right? But the fact is, they brought some money into a team that was bankrupt, and it needed to have a savior, and John Candy brokered that deal. So you're right. He kind of was the de facto commissioner in a way for that first year.
Yeah. And with Bruce McNall, now I know you talked a lot. You talked a lot with him for this book. For those who don't know, I mean, when you talk about how he kind of started, if I understood it correctly, he started out as basically a coin collector, and that's where the empire started that eventually fell.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, he the story goes that he was in a coin shop as a teenager and saw a coin that was like, I don't know, 2,000 years old or something. And it was like, it cost a couple of dollars. And he couldn't believe that you could own something 2,000 years old and pay only $2 for it, or whatever the amount was. It was some insignificant amount of money for this old ancient coin. And that led him to start looking into, antiquities and ancient coins in particular. And of course, he ended up doing some pretty sideways things, like smuggling coins out of Europe in his pants pockets on planes and things. But he parlayed it all into a fortune eventually. At least, well, it was a fortune, but a big part of that fortune was achieved by duping investors, gullible investors who just thought Bruce really was a zillionaire with a Midas touch. And everything he touches turns to gold. Well, it turns out everything he touches was money that somebody else had paid him on false pretenses, basically. But yeah, he's an interesting part of the story. And of course, Bruce admitted to me that when he came in to buy the Argonauts, that he had an ulterior motive. He wanted an NFL franchise in Toronto. He thought he'd get the rights in Skydome and do that, so he made some efforts to do that. There was a lot of Bruce is a very interesting part of the story too. He's a lovable con man. He is a con man, but he's a very lovable guy, right? And Gretzky still likes Bruce. Players, Carl Brazy still likes Bruce. I mean, these guys nobody really had much bad to say about Bruce, despite the fact that he basically ripped off, banks and investors to the tune of $250 million. Brian Cooper, who was the chief operating officer of the team, is mad at Bruce because he got fired and didn't get paid out. And he tells a pretty funny story about, seeing Bruce years later at a Super Bowl party at Wayne Gretzky's place, and Bruce Bruce, affable, gregarious. Hey, how you doing, Brian? Never sorry I didn't pay you, nothing like that, right? So, but everybody else pretty much says Bruce is Bruce, and Bruce was being Bruce back then, and we all just loved the guy because he's got a big goofy grin. He looks like Fred Flintstone. And everything he did seemed to be successful. We found out partway through the ownership of the Argos that everything wasn't successful. It was all a house of cards that he built on, one set of loans, on another set of loans, on another set of loans. And the walls started closing in about the second year of his ownership of the Argos. And by the third year, he was desperate to sell the team because he needed the cash flow.
Right. And the Kings he had the Kings going in LA too. And that was, it sounded to me, and if it sounded to me just from reading your book, that he was using the Kings to keep the Argos afloat.
Well, yeah, it's funny because there were some people in Toronto that thought money was being funneled from the Argonauts down to LA,
right?
Which doesn't really make much sense because the Argos weren't selling as many tickets as they needed to. There wasn't that kind of money flowing in. Right. But that just shows you how weird and wacky the whole thing was. The money was flowing in various directions, and he was trying to constantly stay ahead of his creditors, basically.
Yeah.
The great anecdote in there about how, Danny Webb, the Argos equipment manager, got a call in '93 from the equipment manager of the Kings saying, "Are you having any problems up there?" Because they'd had a bunch of sticks repossessed. Like a stick order had not repossessed, but an order of hockey sticks had not been shipped because the manufacturer was worried they weren't going to get paid. And that was the first time Danny thought, oh, there's something going on here. But there were people in the business offices of the Argos that were thinking, like, why are we sending checks down to LA? What I found out in the book is that it was more Brian Cooper was on the phone to LA saying, we need money. You got to float us more. We can't run this thing. And they weren't paying their bills, right? There were suppliers in Toronto being stiffed by the Argos, which damaged the brand, and maybe in some ways damaged the brand immeasurably, at least among those individuals or businesses. They probably never did business with them again, right?
Right.
Obviously I'm a Matt Dunnigan fan because of the '95 Barracudas, the one and done season there. But, I'm reading about him in your book, which is interesting, but then it leads me down the rabbit hole, which I'll call the Ballad of Ricky Foggy. I mean, that was such a great story about him. And I was completely unaware of how all that played out, but everything from, not getting the start because of, all the shooting up of Matt's shoulder or whatever, to when Mark Rippon is being paraded as the new quarterback while he is the quarterback. I mean, that was kind of just a sad time, you look back on it, because the dude did everything he was asked to do.
I sure did. I mean, Ricky, they would not have got to the Grey Cup in '91 probably if it were not for Ricky Foggy, because Dunnigan was hurt a lot. He kept getting injured and going on the shelf for game after game. They brought in Foggy in midway through the 1990 season because Matt and other quarterbacks were hurt, and he instantly started tearing it up. I mean, he lit the place up. There's a game in 1990 where he threw 7 touchdown passes and ran for 100 yards. I mean, that's never been done in pro football anywhere, as far as I can tell. They won. The Argos were 13-5 in 1991 in the regular season, and I think Foggy was the starter for 10 of the 13 wins. Something like that. And so, and then he had to sit on the bench. He had to take a back seat. He'd never got on the field in the '91 Grey Cup, despite the fact that he played the vast majority of the snaps that year. And he expected to play the Grey Cup because Dunnigan fractured his clavicle the week before in the Eastern Final in 2 places and didn't pick up football all week. He couldn't throw the ball. He couldn't lift his arm and didn't practice. He's in a sling all week long. And Foggy gets told the night before by Adam Rita, if the doctors say Matt can play, he's playing. And Ricky had to basically swallow his pride and accept it. And he, to his credit, he was an absolute team guy. He said to Rita, would you do it if this role was reversed? And he said, absolutely. He said, okay, coach, then I'm with you. And then, you know, there's a great story in the book where in those days, quarterbacks called their own plays. And Dunnigan wasn't calling one play that Rita wanted to call that involved him doing a fake handoff, a play action pass, where he had to sort of turn his back to the defense for a split second to sort of draw them into the running back. And he didn't want to do it because he was really hurt. And even though they'd shot up his shoulder, he was in a lot of pain and he couldn't lift his arm. And Rita said, you either call this player, I'm putting in Foggy. And then he actually said, and then he said to Foggy, warm up. And Foggy says, you're not going to do that. Why you coach? He says, yeah, I damn well am. If he's good enough to play, he's good enough to do the play that I called. And you know what? Dunnigan loves Foggy. Foggy loves Dunnigan. They both love Rita. But you're right. And the Ripper thing is, you know, then Matt leaves in free agency after the season, which was arguably one of the stupid mistakes that the organization made to let him go, because he was the hero of the Grey Cup and he was a marquee name. He was the biggest named quarterback in the league at that time. Flutie was about to overtake him, and he really did in '92. But Dunnigan was a name figure and a charismatic guy that could be sold, right? Good looking, big arm, all that stuff. Gunslinger, and they let him walk because he kept getting hurt and they didn't want to pay him to sit on the injury list. And they're going, oh, well, we'll give the job to Ricky. Well, look how great he did the last 2 years. Well, but as Matt says, and even Ricky would probably basically admit this, better suited as a backup, that you used a lot. He gave him the number one job, and you know, coming out of camp, all of a sudden Mark Rippon's there, the quarterback of the Super Bowl champion Washington football team. And he's on the sidelines in Skydome being touted as the next big name we're going to sign, while Foggy's leading his team to 62 points against the Lions. Like what a slap in the face that was. And then they just went downhill from there in that '92 season. But yeah, Foggy's a great part of the story, and he deserves recognition. I'm glad I was able to write a lot about Ricky because he might be forgotten, right? He was sort of, people would think of Ricky Foggy as a backup quarterback because that's kind of what he was. And he played about 9 or 10 years in the CFL altogether. He even came back years. He was in Arena League for many years and he came back to the CFL briefly, I think. But yeah, backup quarterback, guy with a huge smile on his face, but a humongously important part of the 1991 Argonauts, which was the greatest Argonauts team of all time. Ricky's right up there with Dunnigan and Pinball and some of the others in terms of importance to that team. So I'm glad I was able to sort of capture that in the book as well.
Yeah, and you know, to me, Foggy comes across as very much in that I want to say Don Strock mold. Guy you can point to, get it done. And when I read your book, I kept reflecting back to back during the day, guys like Don Strock, and we've talked to Matt before. So Scott and I are, even more huge fans after spending time with Matt talking about his career. Yeah. When it came to pinball, I mean, you talk about pinball, I mean, there's so many characters, you don't get to spend a whole lot of time with each one. Obviously, Rocket's a huge part of the story. But in terms of pinball's impact on that team, not only for that season, but he's had since he got there, has had a huge impact on the team through the course of the last 30 years now?
32 years. He came up in 89, and he was in his pinball's greatest season arguably was the 1990 season, his second year in the league, his first year as a full-time player. He set the record at the time for the most all-purpose yards in a league with 33 in a season with 3,300. He was an unstoppable weapon, and he won the most outstanding player award that year. And then, of course, he's become the greatest Argonaut of all time since then, right? He went on to play a 12-year career. He twice broke the record for all-purpose yards that he'd set earlier because they converted him to a slot back in the 96, 97 seasons when Flutie was there, and he became an unbelievable weapon as a pass receiver as well as a kick returner. And then, of course, in midway through the 2000 season, when he was in his 12th season as a player, they made him head coach, and he was actually a player coach for about a month before he finally hung up the cleats and took over the coaching reins. And he won a Grey Cup as a coach in 2004, becoming, I believe, the first black head coach to win a Grey Cup in the Canadian Football League. Now he's the general manager of the team. He's been the face of the franchise basically for 30 plus years. It's funny, in 1991, he was hurt a fair bit, and he ended up not being as gigantic a factor on the field as he had been in 1990 when he was the focal point of the offense. But he was a big, important part of the team because he became the mentor on the field, mentor to Rocket. Rocket specifically says, it was his roommate, Carl Brazeley, and his locker mate, Pinball Clemens, that really helped him grow up to become the man that he is now. Pinball, unfortunately, he was hurting bad during that Grey Cup. He suffered a turf toe injury the week before in the Eastern Final, the same one where Dunnigan got his clavicle broken. Pinball on a great touchdown run suffered turf toe, which doesn't sound like a bad injury, but it's an incredibly
it's bad. It's very bad,
debilitating injury. In fact, he said he was hurt all through the '92 season with that injury.
Yeah.
So in the '91 Grey Cup, Pinball had to become the most elaborate decoy imaginable. Calgary had to respect him because of who he was and what he could do, and they took their best defensive back, Darryl, and he shadowed Pinball the whole game, and Pinball ran decoy routes the whole game, including on that play action pass where Dunnigan threw the long touchdown pass to Darryl K. Smith. It was set up by Pinball faking a run into the line, and he only touched the ball, I think, 3 or 4 times in the '91 Grey Cup. He was not the factor that you'd think of, and he certainly was a much bigger factor in the '96 and '97 Grey Cups, but very important as a presence in the market, very important as a presence in the room, and very important as a mentor to Rocket Ismail.
Yeah, and when it comes to Rocket, and I know you he didn't want to be interviewed for the book, and obviously the title is the Year of the Rocket. So let's talk about him coming to Canada. And he was only 20, if I remember the age.
Yeah, he was 21, I believe. I think he turned 22 just before the Grey Cup in '91. So he was 21. Yeah.
So you got a young kid coming up north after standout career at Notre Dame, and all these expectations are put on him as this not only savior of the franchise but savior of the league. Did he kind of know that's what was going to be expected of him at the outset, or it just seems to me he didn't have enough people down here, I guess, saying, hey, this is what's going to be expected of you. Maybe I'm wrong in that.
Yeah, that's a great question, Greg, because there's no doubt in my mind, based on all the research I did, all the interviews I did, and everything I read and watched about this, that the organization itself did not do its full due diligence on whether Rocket had the right mentality to be what they wanted him to be. They wanted to be the Wayne Gretzky of Canadian football, the biggest star, the biggest attraction, the front person, the spokesperson, the savior of the league, as you described it. And it was not his personality was not suited for that. And they did not find that out. The organization did not find that out until he was already on the team. He was in camp. He was, in fact, it was even during training camp that they were starting to see, oh, holy crap, he's not big in all this interaction with the press. He may not have been properly served by his Team Rocket, as they were called, because he had a whole raft of agents and advisors and so on. But at the same time, they're offered to pay you way more than he would have been paid if he had been the #1 draft pick in the NFL, which he was touted as being. They ended up being Russell Maryland, who got picked by the Cowboys, and I think Russell Maryland got paid $8 million over 5 years. Well, Rocket got paid $9 million over 2 years. And it would have been 18 over 4 had he stayed for the last 2 years of the contract. So how could you turn that down? The fact is, Rocket, I think he is, and he was a really lovable, gregarious guy in many ways. He's got a great smile, and he's a fun person to be around, but he didn't want to do it publicly. He's happy to do it in the locker room and with his friends, but he wasn't happy to do it in front of the cameras. And for better or worse, they didn't find that out until it was they were in, like they're locked into him. He did, to his credit, he performed on the field, particularly in '91. He lived up to his money. But the thing is, his money wasn't being paid for on the field, right? They needed him to help them win the Grey Cup, but he made his CFL playing contract was $110,000. His sponsorship and promotion contract was $4.5 million. So they needed that was the reason he was up here. It wasn't because he was going to give the Argos another weapon. Sure, that was nice. And that last weapon became a hugely important weapon for the team as they got deeper into that season. But yeah, you know, he I don't think he knew what he was in for. I think he probably thought it'll just be like Notre Dame. I'll be sheltered. I'll be shielded. I'll play on the field. I'll become good friends with my teammates. I'll be a good team man. I'll defer to the stars like Dunnigan and Pinball and DK, and everything will be fine. But you know what? $4.5 million, which in those days was gigantic money. You got to do more than defer to those guys and tell journalists to go talk to Pinball. You got to be out front all the time. And so that was a problem. And it's one of the reasons the year of the Rocket. I mean, the whole Rocket, everything revolved around the Rocket to some extent that year, on the field and off the field. And the off the field stuff is the part that is just kind of astonishing in some ways. You know, the fact that it happened the way it did. You almost wouldn't believe it. There's a quote, I think, on the book from Stephen Brunt, like, if this was a Hollywood script, you wouldn't believe it. And it's kind of true. Like, you know, it just seems just incredible to think that this all could have happened, that they could have given that much money to that kid and nobody thought to, like, let's give him some psychological tests, or let's test him out and see how he is handling the press. You know, it didn't dawn on them until too late.
And it struck me just in reading, just talking about when he was off the field, there was a bit of loneliness on his part, and that's kind of what came out. It's like, I mean, and obviously Rocket Ismail has always been a good player. I mean, you know, there's no, I guess, for lack of a better term, there's never been any scandal associated with him. Yeah. Good kid, but just lonely in a different place. So
yeah, absolutely. I mean, he was 21, as you said, and that was a team of 30 something guys, right? With wives and kids, and some of them had other jobs even during the season. And he was really kind of on his own. He was plunked down into an expensive condominium in downtown Toronto, back before Toronto became overrun with expensive condominiums. And he was not, he didn't really have anybody to hang out with. I mean, you know, the guys, after practice, the guys would go home to their kids. Some guys partied, but he wasn't a partier, so he wasn't inclined to didn't want to go to bars because he was afraid he was going to be mobbed, because he probably would have been. He was a big face around the town. So we basically went between Sky Dome and 3 blocks away into his condo and didn't do much else. He had, sit there and watch TV or play video games in his condo. There's this unbelievable scene in the book when the camera crew that was following the Argos around for a documentary that year went up to his condo to film him watching a Notre Dame game, and it's bleak. Like, it's just him and this young guy who might have been a 12 or 15-year-old kid that he'd befriended because he didn't really know anybody his own age. And he's just watching this game on TV, and then as the filmmaker told me, after the filming was done, Rocket kind of wanted the two that were up there to sort of hang out with him, and they're like, well, that's kind of weird. Like, he wants us to stay, right? And he was lonely. He absolutely was. His mom was in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. His brother, the second brother was at Syracuse University. The third brother, I think, was still in high school in Wilkes-Barre. So he had no relatives. He made, Carl Brazee was a great mentor for road games, but, Carl had a family, and Carl lived at a home somewhere in the Toronto area. He wasn't going to hang out with Rocket every day. Pinball had other stuff to do. There was only one other guy on that team that was 21 years old, JP Esquerdo, who was a Canadian running back / slot back out of the University of Calgary. The two had virtually nothing in common other than their age. I mean, JP Square was making $30,000. Rocket was making $4.5 million. And JP, you know, came out of a hard Scrabble environment in Western Canada. Rocket came out of Notre Dame, small town before that in Wilkes-Barre. But so yeah, he was a lonely guy. I mean, I hoped that in the book it would capture. You're right, Greg. He didn't speak to me about, you know, he wouldn't be interviewed, and that's too bad, because I would have liked to have heard his view on everything now that 30 years have passed. But I wanted to make sure that it was a well-rounded picture to show that it wasn't just, this wasn't a bad dude. This was a guy who had an unbelievable amount of pressure thrust upon him. And many people would not have responded properly. There aren't that many Wayne Gretzkys. As Gretzky's dad said to Bruce McNall, there's only one Wayne Gretzky. You know, Gretzky was used to dealing with the press. He was 11 years old, and by the time he bought the team along with McNall and Candy, he was in his 30s, and he could handle that stuff no problem. Rock had been a small town in Pennsylvania. Then he went to Notre Dame, where he was really well insulated and protected. He did have to talk to the press from time to time, as I learned, and it comes out in the book. But he really didn't have a whole lot of hassles at Notre Dame. Not the kind you have when you're the savior of an entire football league, right?
Yeah, there's a huge difference between the South Bend media and the media of an entire country.
Yeah, absolutely. And Notre Dame is this massively successful institution that was successful before Rocket got there. Was going to be successful after he left. There wasn't I got to go and sell tickets in a city where they've gone bankrupt. You know, like I don't know how much of that specific stuff he even understood or took on himself, but I know that the organization felt they had to kind of give him remedial media training from Candy and Gretzky pretty early on in the '91 season. He basically said, guys, like, it's not that I don't want to do it. I just don't know how. I've never done it, which, as it turned out, was not quite true. But it was true that he didn't like doing it and was really not interested in doing it. And maybe that's one of the reasons he didn't want to talk to me, because he just didn't want to talk about that. Who knows?
Well, and you know, I just think back when I'm 21 years old, and obviously I was already in the spotlight like him, but these are still babies. You know, unfortunately, fans look at sports figures not as humans, but as, you know, they're performing a function, but they're human beings. Yep. And yeah, I thought you really captured that so well. I mean, this, at his core, he's just a kid, and he's a kid who's away from home. He's got every spotlight in Canada, yep, you know, shining on him. I mean, that's a tough spot to be in, regardless of how much money you make.
Oh yeah, and the money just makes the pressure that much worse, right? Like, right. Is it worth it? Is it worth the $4.5? You didn't know how to spend the money anyway, and now I'm because I'm making all this money, they expect all this from me, and I'd rather just a good teammate, a good guy in the locker room, and give me the ball, put the ball in my hands. And so yeah, you absolutely have to feel for him. It was basically they put him in a completely untenable situation off the field. Luckily, they had a great veteran group of players that were quite happy to absorb him into their ranks on the field, and of course he became an absolute weapon. You know, he started off that year, as I say, I think he only got four passes in the first 4 games of the season, but by the end of the year, he was the best receiver in the league, in my opinion. He was an unbelievable weapon. He, coming down the stretch every week, he made at least one gigantic play, an 80-yard touchdown here, 50-yard touchdown there. He was just lighting it up as he got down the stretch. He basically blew open the Eastern Final by a punt return touchdown midway through the first quarter, and then of course he scored the iconic touchdown in the Grey Cup that basically salted the victory away for the Argos and led to the beer can coming out of the stands and all that stuff. So yeah, he absolutely lived up to his billing as a player that year. Not so much the second year, but the whole thing went south the second year. But yeah, I don't know anybody that could have done. I mean, you know, people have said, and it would have been interesting if they put that kind of money on Pinball Clemens and made him the focal point. You know, he could have handled it probably, but they didn't. I mean, for better or worse, they had. If you could have taken Rocket's ability and Pinball's personality, you would have had the greatest player in the history of sports, right? The greatest selling, the greatest marketing and athletic thing in the history of sports. As it was, Pinball was a fantastic player, and I'm not to take anything away from his athletic ability, because he was amazing. But you know, if they'd somehow, after the 1990 season, if McNall and Gretzky and Candy had come up, bought the team, and said, and you know what, we've got this unbelievable superstar here in Pinball Clemens, and we're going to make him the highest paid football, I think people would have been pretty happy to follow behind pinball, and he's got the personality for it. He would not have minded being thrust into the limelight that way. So there you
And
go.
plus, too, he's got the skills to back it up too. And
absolutely, that's right. He's a Hall of Fame player. He's literally the best Argonaut player in the history of the 150-year-old franchise, I think. I mean, in terms of longevity and ability, he's got the most all-purpose yards in the history of Canadian football, right? 25,000 all-purpose yards in 12 seasons. So, and plus he won a Grey Cup as a coach, and he's won a Grey Cup as an executive, and he's rebuilding franchise now, and hopefully they will be able to succeed in the marketplace. He does. He's got all the abilities to back that up, as well as the greatest personality. He's the John Candy of football players, basically, right? The most lovable individual you're ever going to meet. Everybody who meets Pinball Clemens face to face comes away absolutely loving the guy. You'll meet him, and you'll meet him once, and then you'll see him 8 years later, and he might remember your name. Like, it's unbelievable.
Well, and then, and just talking about that, I mean, the CFL, we all know, I mean, all three of us, I mean, we follow the league. We know who the stars are. The CFL has some great stars. So can you see a return here, and hopefully within the next season or two, where all the stars are marketed? Because there are some compelling storylines when we go into every week, even though, for instance, the Elks didn't do that, but there were some compelling storylines there. And personalities do sell the sport. I mean, in every sport, obviously, basketball and hockey being, good examples of that. And the football, the NFL. I mean, to quote Sonny Werblin's wife back in the '60s, football show business. Do you see a return for the CFL to market those stars? Because we're at that point now, I guess, without having to dwell too much on the future, but I think there's definitely a need to sell the stars that are out there.
Well, there's a need to sell a lot of things, and the stars are certainly one of them. Part of the problem that the league faces is that they've created this situation where almost every veteran signs a 1-year contract. So there's massive free agency every year. So you never know who's going to be on your team from year to year. You get a big name player. Next year, he might be on your rivals. So that's a problem. There's also the sad reality that because it's not a high-paying league, some people, and particularly I think it's fair to say in the Toronto market, look down upon it as rinky-dink. It's the NFL's paying Pat Mahomes $50 million, and he's on TV every week, and the games are incredibly well produced and entertaining spectacles. And the Argos are paying, their top paid players making $150,000 or something, and a lot of people are making less than people in the stands are making. So it's hard to kind of build that into stardom. I think is the veneer of stardom, right? How do you make it showbiz when guys have to go and get jobs in the off season so that they can